Hey there, humans and robots of YouTube. Park Melton here with another video. As you can see in the title, today we're going to be talking about what I consider the 10 best debut albums of the 1960s. So, when I'm talking about the best debut albums, I'm basically looking at two different things. One, how much do I like it? So, does it slap? Is it a banger? Obviously, pretty subjective. The other thing I'm looking at is what I call the three I's of musical importance. We have impact, which is both cultural impact and the effect that the album had on their musical contemporaries. Influence, which is essentially what sort of effect did it have on the artists that would come later. Some of these albums affected people generations later, still affecting people now. And then the third I is innovation. So, did the album break new ground? Did it sort of explore new genres? Some of these albums even gave birth to new genres, that sort of thing. So, how much do I like it? The three I's of musical importance, trademark, Park Melton. So let's go ahead and get started. First I have Walk Don't Run by The Ventures. This came out in 1960. This album really popularized the electric guitar. A lot of people cite this album as a direct influence. George Harrison, Stephen Stills, the Wilson Brothers of the Beach Boys. The list goes on and on. This album is fully instrumental. I think it's primarily or exclusively covers, some country stuff going on in there. Really cool album. Kind of gave birth to surf rock, not necessarily the first surf rock album per se, but definitely helped kind of move music in that direction, which I think is kind of interesting because the Ventures never really felt like that label applied to them, and I guess they would know. Standout tracks for me are Raunchy and The Switch, but really the whole album's a lot of fun. I kind of prefer the up-tempo stuff to the down-tempo stuff, but the whole album pretty solid. Next I have High Were the Miracles by The Miracles. This came out in 1961. This was a really big album for a few reasons. It was the first album released by Motown Records, and it was a rousing success, which was really good for Motown because they became a veritable hit machine throughout the rest of the 60s and beyond. It launched the career of Smokey Robinson, who would have a pretty big impact. You can hear the influence from this album on the early Beatles records. They even covered some Miracles songs. Really, really cool album. I really like it because it kind of feels like it's bridging the gap between the popular music of the 50s and the popular music of the 60s. There's doo-wop influence on here, there's R&B, there's a little bit of soul, and it kind of all comes together really cohesively. Really fun album. Standout tracks, Shop Around, very important song for Motown. It was their first single that went to number one, their first single that pushed 1 million units. So, it's a really fun song too. My other favorite song off of this album is Who's Lovin' You. I think anybody who's had a messy breakup can probably empathize with this song a little bit. Covered to great effect by the Temptations, Jackson 5. I think En Vogue did a cover of it. Really cool song. Really good album. Next I have My Generation by The Who. This came out in 1964. I felt like it would be impossible for me to make this list without putting some British invasion on it. Probably would expect Please Please Me over My Generation, but I actually prefer My Generation. I think it rocks way harder. I think it's more indicative of what The Who were capable of, and Please Please Me would be indicative of what the Beatles were capable of. Standout tracks for me are The Ox. just a raucous, good time. Keith Moon just absolutely beating the life out of his drum set. The title track, of course, is the perfect anthem of teenage rebellion. Love the bass line in My Generation. But the drums for me are really like the standout point of the album. Really good songwriting for a first effort. Beautiful. Next we have Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. This came out in 1965. This album, kind of a helped usher in the burgeoning genres of country rock and folk rock. The jingle jangle of the 12-string Rickenbacker that Roger McGuinn was playing spawned a lot of imitators. I don't think anybody got it quite as good as he did, but it also served the purpose of bringing the music of Bob Dylan to a broader audience, which, I mean, I love Bob Dylan. I think his vocal style is kind of a barrier for some people, for better or for worse, and, for whatever reason, people liked the way the Byrds did his songs. It's a very popular album. It kind of also touches on what would become psychedelic rock a little bit. The Byrds definitely explored that to greater effect on later albums, but you can definitely hear, kind of a hint of that coming. Standout tracks for me, Here Without You, just wonderful song. I really like the Byrds' rendition of All I Want to Do. Bob's seems a little like whimsical, and I think the Byrds kind of rein it in a little bit. And then I Knew I'd Want You, also just a really great song off the album. Next, I have Freak Out by the Mothers of Invention. This came out in 1966. This album is really hard to describe. It's kind of one of the progenitors of what would become progressive rock. There's some real meandering, wild songs on it. The story of the album is kind of wild too, because when the band was pitched to MGM, they were pitched as a white blues band. I would give almost anything in the world to be in the room when this album was played for the record executives for the first time, and they heard this terrifying yet whimsical, dark and sardonic but super sarcastic take on popular culture of the time. I imagine the jaws just dropped to the floor. This album, I can't give you a standout track because if you're going to listen to it, you have to listen to the whole thing. It's just one of those albums. Frank Zappa wasn't really a big fan of hippies, wasn't a big fan of the Beatles, which is ironic because this album is allegedly a direct influence on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I don't think, Frank Zappa didn't really hold the Beatles in high regard, so it's kind of funny that they drew influence from him, but totally wild album. You need to listen to it. Next we have The Velvet Underground and Nico by The Velvet Underground. This came out in 1967. This album, real game changer. Nobody bought it. It was a commercial and critical absolute failure. The record company thought that it would be a shoo-in because Andy Warhol's name was attached to it, and he was very popular at the time, doing his whole Plastic Inevitable tour. Nobody bought the album. This is due to a couple of reasons. One, people probably weren't ready for it. It's got a lot of dark themes on it. It deals with drug abuse and, sort of what would be considered at the time sexual perversion. In this day and age, the sexuality of the album is pretty tame compared to what the kind of stuff that we've been exposed to now. We're kind of desensitized to it in this day and age. But at the time, being kind of upfront about sadomasochism and prostitution, that was pretty unheard of. So, the album was not on display in record stores, wasn't even carried by a lot of record stores. If you wanted it, you had to, have the guy bring it out from behind the counter, that kind of thing. So nobody bought it. But they say, there's kind of a saying that goes with this album, it only sold 30,000 copies, but everybody who bought a copy started a band. You can hear shades of, what would be punk rock and, the sort of bastard child between punk rock and pop, that would be new wave. And then maybe, more directly, some of the experimental stuff that would come later, like drone rock and noise rock, shoegaze. You can hear all of that on this album. Really, really groundbreaking. Can't really be overstated how influential this album is. I think the thing that makes the album what it is sort of the contrast or complementary even aspect of John Cale's experimental nature and Lou Reed's just gritty realism. This is an album that doesn't pull any punches. The world wasn't all flowers and peace signs. like what was happening on the radio. You know, the world has always been a dark place, and Lou Reed wasn't afraid to explore it lyrically. Standout tracks for me, Heroin, the tempo changes, just beautiful. Venus and Furs, this song makes me feel dirty. I love listening to it. Sunday Morning, I'm a relatively new father. I've got a 2-year-old. Sunday morning's a real kind of emotional experience. Next we have Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. This came out in 1967. This is another album which the impact of is really hard to overstate. This album kind of redefined the electric guitar in a lot of ways. Also can't really understate Noel and Mitch's contribution as well. But the thing about Jimi Hendrix is, you know, the feedback and gain and overdriven amplifiers and distortion, all of that wasn't necessarily brand new, but the way that Jimi Hendrix kind of wove it all together into a coherent and marketable musical tapestry, it's really what set him apart. And, you know, even to this day, 50 some odd years after his death, he's still regarded as, a lot of people say, the best guitarist, and definitely very near the top of the list, if not the best. And the legacy, he earned that. He's not my personal favorite guitarist, but listening to the music that would come in the wake of Jimi Hendrix and this first album in particular, you hear his influence all over the place. And this is kind of a bold thing to say, but I think as long as people are making music centered around the electric guitar, they're probably going to have something that they owe to Jimi. Just because he left such a lasting impact on the instrument and the way it's used, and kind of pushing the boundaries. When you watch Jimi play, like I like him at the Monterey Pop Festival, for example, but you can just tell the way that he's treating his instrument. It's an extension of himself. It doesn't. You can't tell where Jimi ends and the guitar begins, so to speak. He's just so fully engrossed in his art. It's really a sight to see. Next I have Grizz Grizz by Dr. John. This came out in 1968. This album, not a huge commercial success, and when you listen to it, you might be able to see why a little bit. It's a little wild sounding. The production isn't perfect, but it gives it a real kind of DIY, interesting sound, in my personal opinion. I guess, it's considered sort of a marriage between psychedelic rock and New Orleans R&B. I think there are a little bit of shades of psychedelic rock in here because of the way that the songs are structured. This is just a really wild album. I love it. It wasn't the first Dr. John album I listened to. I had to kind of backtrack and find it. And so I was very surprised when I heard it, because his later stuff doesn't sound quite like this. He leans a little bit more into the funk grain than this sort of experimental stuff that he does on this album. So it was really interesting for me to, come from it from that perspective when I listened to it the first time. This is another album that, if you got the time, you should listen to the whole thing, because a lot of the tracks on it sound pretty different, so it's interesting in that regard. But standout tracks for me are Don Slumbo and I Walk on Gilded Splinters. Like I said, the whole album's worth checking out, but those two kind of stick out to me. I Walk on Gilded Splinters in particular, I really like the rhythm, the beat of it. It's a really cool song. Next we have In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. This came out in 1969. This album, another very influential album. Psychedelic rock was, sort of on its way out, and progressive rock was coming to take its place, in my personal opinion. That album sales-wise, that might not necessarily be true, but as far as, pushing the boundaries on experimentation, that's kind of the direction things were going, from my perspective. And King Crimson, they kind of came out of the gates really strong with this album. The people that were in King Crimson were all incredible at their craft, virtuosos, as you might call them. And, progressive rock is a sort of an attempt to elevate rock music from lowbrow to highbrow through combining classical / symphonic music with, jazz music and, a little bit of folk music, all sort of put on top of the sort of up-tempo R&B / country influences that were the core of rock and roll. All of that kind of coming together in a really, coherent way. It wasn't something that King Crimson invented, per se, but I think when this album came out, they set the bar really high, and a lot of the progressive rocks that would come out in the 70s, or even were already out at this time, but sort of evolving, they listened to this album and they took note. They said, wow, listen to what these guys are doing, that's amazing. Maybe we can do something as creative and interesting as that. So this album is really important to me as a progressive rock fan because it opened the door for the stuff that came later. King Crimson sort of redefined themselves in every album. So the sound of In the Court of the Crimson King isn't really something that is replicated on later albums per se, so it's really cool in that regard too, as just sort of a snapshot in time of a group of musicians doing what they're doing. Really interesting, really great. It is definitely a progressive rock album, so I can't give you a standout track. You have to listen to the whole thing. I wouldn't even try to tell you to listen to an individual song. Just go ahead and do the whole thing if you're going to do it. I have one more, but before we get to it, I want to talk about an honorable mention. You see, in the 60s, there were a lot of really great debut albums. There was a lot of experimentation going on. It was really hard for me to narrow this list down to 10. I had a bunch of honorable mentions, but that seemed kind of excessive. So I narrowed it down to just one, which is 5 Leaves Left by Nick Drake. This came out in 1969. I really went back and forth on whether or not I should put this album on the list, but I was kind of putting it there for personal reasons, not necessarily because it was a hugely impactful or influential or even innovative album, although Nick Drake's playing style is definitely very interesting. I think it didn't have a huge impact because people didn't really listen to it so much. John Cale from the Velvet Underground listened to it and actually would play on Nick Drake's next album, Brighter Later. But this one, there's really cool orchestral stuff, and he's a phenomenal acoustic guitarist. If you're into acoustic guitar music at all, you should definitely check him out. I've never heard anybody that sounds like him. Maybe the closest in my personal, knowledge of music at the time would be Joni Mitchell, because she also used really interesting guitar tunings and kind of explored her instrument and, kind of approached it from an interesting perspective. But yeah, this album, really great. Didn't make the list, but it's an honorable mention. My standout tracks are 3 Hours, Man in a Shed, and Riverman has a special place in my heart because it was the first song by Nick Drake I ever heard, and I was really blown away by it. But back to the main list. In the last spot, I have Led Zeppelin's self-titled debut, came out in 1969. For whatever reason, they didn't take it upon themselves to give credit where credit was due for a lot of songs on this album, and even later in their career they did that a little bit, which is a shame, because I think if they would have, the album would be held in even higher regard than it already is. It's really phenomenal. The stuff that Jimmy Page was trying out, experimenting while he was in the Yardbirds, kind of came together on this album, and it was a showstopper when it came out. People had to take note of it because he was phenomenal. Again, it's not just Jimmy Page; it's the whole band coming together. I think Led Zeppelin's actually a really good example of a whole being greater than the sum of its parts, because each individual musician in Led Zeppelin is very talented, but the way that they all come together is just amazing. And the fact that they, culminated their sound so well on their very first effort, I think is pretty impressive too, because they definitely would get better than this album. So it's amazing to me that it happened so well for them. Standout tracks for me are Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, which is one of those songs that they did not give credit where credit was due for. And then Dazed and Confused, kind of in the same grain. Both of those songs really phenomenal. So thanks for sticking through the whole list for me. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If your favorite debut album from the 60s didn't make the list, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to see what you think. Like I said, there were a lot of albums that I went back and forth on that didn't make the cut. I'd be curious to see if maybe your favorite album was one of them. But yeah, thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next time.